Good afternoon, everybody, and namaste. I am deeply honored to introduce our keynote speaker today. Bandana Rana is currently serving as the committee chair of the Working Group of Inquiries of the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, otherwise known as CEDAW, pronounced CEDAW, where, until recently, she served 2 consecutive terms as vice chair. Ms. Rana has been a member of the UN CEDAW since 2017. She is an independent gender expert and key member of the women's movement of Nepal, having worked at the grassroots, national, regional, and global level, addressing extensive discrimination against marginalized, destitute, and conflict-affected women and girls. She has founded and led national, regional, and global networks, as well as women's shelters to work and advocate for the full development and advancement of women, addressing their political, economic, social, cultural, and civil rights. Ms. Rana has extensive experience in leading national, regional, and global advocacy, research, and political outreach programs for policy reforms. She is a gifted and effective collaborator who has linked UN instruments, particularly CEDAW, the International Conference on Population and Development, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 on Women, Peace, and Security, and the UN's Strategic Development Goals to local, national, and regional initiatives. With more than 3 decades of life-changing work, I'll stop here and welcome my friend Bandana Rana.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anita, for that kind introduction. And it's good morning, everyone. I think it's still morning there. Very, very warm greetings from Nepal to all of you who are doing such wonderful work through your United Nations Association of Dane County, which is commendable. And I'm honored to be the keynote speaker today. But what I intend to do, as you have said, the theme of this event today is United Women, United Nations, Shaping the Future of Our World. And how I would like to title my keynote is Local to Global and Global to Local, Shaping a Gender Equal World with UN Instruments. And in doing so, I will actually share some snapshots of my journey as a gender activist, as a women's rights activist, and how the numerous UN mandates have come into use while advocating and promoting gender equality. So it's basically, I will run you through my own experience in promoting gender equality with the UN mechanisms that are available in the last 3 decades or even more, actually. So in doing so, I would like to tell you, of course, I'm from Nepal. I was born in Nepal. I was born in Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal. But I never, as a young girl, as a young child, I never thought I would be a women's rights activist, because I never thought that there was any violation or that I was being discriminated against, because whatever I learned as I grew up was a natural phenomenon, being a woman, that you had to go through. However, there are 3 things that change my course of action and why I decided to become a women's rights activist. It wasn't intentional, but I think sometimes your destiny is paved, and as little things give you the clue that this is the course of action that you should be taking. And today, I'm proud to say I'm a lifetime passionate advocate for gender equality in every phase, at every level, and every geographical areas that I work for. Now, those 3 things that I want to mention, I started my career as a broadcast journalist in the television station, the government-owned television station. There was no television in Nepal that opened in Nepal in the 1980s. So when I joined as a broadcast journalist, as in a subordinate role, as a news anchor, as well as an editor and reporter, most of the media at that time was a mainstream media. There were very few women, and I was happy actually doing the work that I was told to do as a subordinate in a subordinate position, and getting a pat on the back saying, "Oh, well done, good, excellent," and that's all that I required. That's it. I was happy doing that. However, in 1988, I got the opportunity to go to Netherlands with another male colleague, a journalist from the television itself, the two of us, for a news and current affairs production. And this was my first international visit. What I learned there is the professors. It was a small class. It was a mixed class, male as well as female, but very few female. And the professors would actually first ask me that you can call me John, you can call me Joe, which was very unusual for me, because we actually, in our culture, even your own compatriots, or sometimes even junior colleagues, you call them sir, So this was very unusual for me, and I couldn't unlearn that, to call a senior professor by the first name. So, but that's just to tell you what it was like. But the fact that, in the coming days, they would present a certain theory, and then they would pick up students and tell them, what do you think of this theory? What is your opinion? And they would pick me up very often, maybe because I came from a country where they had never met anyone before, very far away. And I was among the few women who were there. So they would ask me, Bandana, now what do you think about this? And that was so difficult for me, because I think I grew up, I realized that I had grown up in a culture where people had never asked my opinion. So when people asked my opinion of a certain philosophy or principle that they presented, it was easy for me to memorize and say that, okay, I studied in a girls' school. It was the only missionary school in Nepal, St. Mary's. And I actually was very good in memorizing, and I would study hard and write what I memorized and get good marks. And no one asked me what my opinion was, But here was this professor asking me what my opinion was on a principle that he would present, and it was very difficult to give my own thoughts, because I was never taught up or nurtured or trained to give my own opinion, to think for myself, to have a different opinion than male seniors, So it was, the first few days, it was very difficult. So here I'm sharing this story because even till now, there are many times, thousands and thousands of girls and women who don't have a voice, who don't have a visibility, who don't even have an identity, So at that point, it took me some time. It was with a lot of hesitation, I started responding and giving my own thoughts on the principle that was presented. And that wasn't easy, I realized, because you needed to think. And I was actually not thinking all the time. I was memorizing, So gradually, I felt that the experience that I gained there, and when I gave with a lot of fear, with a lot of intimidation, when I gave my opinion, I would be surprised that these seniors would appreciate a different opinion that I had. And this is the first time I realized that even being a woman, a junior woman, I can have my own thoughts, I can have my own opinion, and senior people can appreciate and respect that opinion. Now, this wasn't a culture that I had grown up in. So this was a very different culture that I learned in an overseas learning environment. So I always say, I think I must have been around 25, early 20s at that time. I always say, though I was a woman from Nepal who grew up in the cities, compared to many girls, I had better opportunities of education. But even me, it took me 24, 25 years to find my own voice, to find my own thoughts, to find my identity, actually, my own identity, and recognize I did pretty well during my entire course over there. And I had thought that the potential, the capacity that I myself had not recognized within me, I could bring out over there. So I was very surprised. So that gave me one niche that it took me so many years to find my voice and my visibility. There are thousands of women back in Nepal, in the urban and mostly, of course, rural areas, who never find their voice, who never will get any visibility, will never know their own identity and potential, and will die. So that thought disturbed me a lot. So when I went back to Nepal, I tried to bring in changes from the things that I had learned overseas. And that's when the battle started. I realized that when you start having different opinions, when you start thinking things can be done differently, then you are not liked anymore. That's the first battle, because one, you are a woman, one, you are young, and how can you have your own opinion, and just because you have come back from an overseas training or an overseas course. So that's when earlier I was liked by everyone, but that's when my battle started. And then I gradually learned to be very firm in my beliefs and show my fangs and teeth when needed, when required, so I gradually, so that was, I think, my growing into the activism, because of the discrimination that I faced within the workplace, let's say. And also women's issues were not prioritized. I worked in the newsroom. In the newsroom, it never got into the priority news. And that was another thing that disturbed me after I had come back from the Netherlands. And my second point, my, again, turning points that I call, is, in 1991, I was assigned, and that was my first opening with UN, let me say, knowing UN as such and working with the UN, though briefly. So my first, I got an assignment where I was to make a documentary, rather compile voices of people, different sorts of people, to whom asking the question what human development meant for them, or human rights meant for them, And that was on the occasion of the first Human Development Report of UNDP that was coming out. This was 1991. So it was on that occasion, I think the voices were being collected from all global areas, and I was assigned this task to collect voices from rural areas in Nepal. And it was the first time I got the opportunity to visit many rural areas in Nepal. I interviewed a number of men. It was very easy to interview the men. They had a voice, they were very confident, they were not shy, they were not intimidated by the mic. The mics at those times used to be quite huge, the camera also quite huge, not the tiny mics that you have now, and they were not intimidated. But no one had told me that I should also interview women. But having come from that, I felt, no, I don't have any women's voices, so I need women's voices. So every time I tried to interview a woman and put the mic in front of her, there would be 4 men answering for, oh, she's too shy. She doesn't know anything. She cannot speak, So I felt very disturbed. And I said, I need to befriend these women. And when is it that I can? And I didn't hear their voice in front of the men. So I stayed longer and I actually tried to befriend the women. And the only time that they were alone and I could hear their voices were early in the morning at 4 a.m. when they went out to fetch, to carry waters, to fetch drinking water from a local tap. And that's where the women gathered at 4 a.m. in the morning. So I started going there and I befriended them. And then I realized, of course, they didn't know what human development is, but I told them, what is it that troubles them the most? What is it that makes them sad? And that's the time of course, I had known about domestic violence and all that, but hearing it firsthand from women who faced domestic violence, who faced sexual violence, who faced physical battering, mental violence. In many cases, in Nepal, there are open borders with India. So there's cross-border marriages. And there's violence because you do not bring enough dowry in your marriages. So these kinds of violence was the things that troubled them the most. And the workload that they did, even if the food was a little bit raw or uncooked, or there was less salt, they would get a beating. So that troubled me a lot. And I think that was when I felt that I was a journalist. I had access to policymakers. I had a voice. And I perhaps need to bring the voices of these women to the policy table, to change policies, to influence policies, to shape policies. So that was my growing into my activism. So it's not something I intended to be, but it's my experiences along my journey, life's journey, that led me to this way. So that was my second experience. My third experience was in 1995. I got the opportunity to attend the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, called the Beijing Conference, as you all know. I was a young journalist again, and to be with those 30,000 collective voice, the power that I derived from that collective movement, how powerful I felt, how strong I felt to be together. And particularly the 12 areas of concern that were ratified as the Beijing Platform for Action, one of them was women in media, and I realized, I met a lot of other media women there also, and I realized that media can play a very powerful role to shape policies, to shape changes, to bring about significant changes in women's lives. And here was my second engagement with the UN. This was a UN conference of the Fourth World Conference of Women. So I was getting to know how a UN passes a document called the Beijing Platform for Action, and how including my country, ratifies those documents. And that is the ratification or the adoption of this political document is a commitment to implement that at the local level back in your country. So that gave me the realization that I can look at the commitment made, and I can go back to my country, and as a journalist also, and ask my country politicians, those who are in the leadership positions, like what is happening about those commitments. So that's how my advocacy role started. That was my first inning through the Beijing conference. And I realized how UN instruments can play a powerful role, because if you ask a question based on a UN document that you have ratified, that you have adopted, the advocacy for policy changes becomes stronger. And being a women media worker, I also realized that women in the media need to work together, need to have a collective movement. I believed in movement. I really believe in movement building, and working collectively, and like you all do in your associations. So I, in 1995 was the Beijing conference, and 1996 I founded, along with other women journalists, a women's media forum, which is called Sancharika Sumua. And I'm happy that it's already celebrating its 25th year. It's doing very well. There are young journalists now taking up the leadership. The network is throughout the country, and they have, we were successful in some ways, engendering of improving the portrayal of women in the media, encouraging young women to join journalism, and harnessing the potential of the media for advocacy and to bring about changes in leaderships, in economic, political, cultural lives of women and people. So that was my other innings. So these were the three innings that actually led me into my advocacy and my gender equality work. Now, coming to, what I have done with these instruments is as I said, I believe in movement building. So I would like to give 2 or 3 examples of my movement building and advocacy where I've used a lot of UN instruments, and I found it to be very effective. One, we did not have a domestic violence law. And, my experience with the rural women who shared with me their personal stories about domestic violence, that inspired me, because I felt just being a young journalist in a subordinate role in a huge TV institution, I cannot bring about that change. I need to have a collective power. So we, in 1992, actually 8 of us, we founded an organization, a non-governmental organization called Sati, which means friend in Nepali. And our prime objective was to address domestic violence. And that time, even our family discouraged us. They said domestic violence is a private topic. You cannot have a work agenda as domestic violence. No one talks about it. You cannot intervene in people's lives. So we were very discouraged at that time, but we were very committed. We were adamant. We knew domestic violence was a big issue. And with that agenda in mind, we had the Sati organization. And we founded the first women's shelter in Nepal in 1995. Today, Sati runs 4 women's shelters and 5 children's shelters in the country. And we do a lot of advocacy. We do community mobilizations. We empower young girls. And actually, we work with men and boys. You know, I was so glad to see the 100 Black men get the award. Congratulations to them. But I also think engaging men and boys is extremely necessary to bring about societal changes, to bring about the change in the mindset, you know, which stereotypes the women's roles, which stigmatizes women. So I think engaging men and boys, not all men are bad. You know, there are men who are great allies and who can bring about changes. So we have to engage with them to bring about that change. So through Sati and through this Women's Media Forum that I talked about, I was engaged a lot in advocating for the domestic violence law. And that's when I used the CEDAW convention. You know, we had to lobby for it for many years. In fact, the first draft bill, it took us 14 years for the domestic, but I remember the time when we started advocating and drafting the first act for the domestic violence law. To the time that it got adopted, it was 14 years. But towards the end, you know, because I had realized now how UN instruments work. So I actually, first of all, I believed in movement building. So I founded National Network Against Domestic Violence. And it was alliance of more than 100 organizations from all over the country. So with a strong voice, with a strong presence, and with a strong mandate, grounded by the CEDAW Convention, that you need to address, you know, and to end discrimination, you have to have effective legislations. And one of the most important legislation was the domestic violence law. So through these advocacy, finally in 2009, the domestic violence law got adopted in Nepal. And again, that taught me how important UN documents is. You know, all of us know UN is, sometimes people are very skeptical about UN. Oh, the UN, the big elephant, you know, but you know, that is the only entity, that is the only mechanism that unites the world, you know, that makes the world accountable. So we have to make the best of the UN mechanism that we have. And I'm so glad to hear that you have such associations, United Nations associations throughout the US. And I would really like to congratulate your Dane County Association and your leadership in this, to engage and to continue engaging with the UN mechanisms to make it positive. So coming back now to my journey, one was the domestic violence law. I told you there are numerous, but I'm just taking some examples. The other part was, you know, Nepal went through a conflict from 1996 to 2006. And through Sati, you know, an organization working for violence against women, we worked with conflict-affected women and girls during the conflict time, empowering them, providing them support services where needed, shelters. And when the war, you know, and I had actually gathered so much positive experiences of local women to promote peace, or even trying to create harmony during the conflict time, because they were torn between the state armed force and the non-state armed force, and they had to survive. Most men had either fled the country or joined the rebels, and so there were actually women mostly in the rural communities, you know, where they had to, and these were women who earlier were restricted within the 4 walls of the house. They wouldn't even raise their veil and look at people face to face. But it was a matter of survival. And they then threw away their veil and started negotiating for their survival, for the survival of the family. So they had so much positive experiences in promoting peace at the local level. But when the war ended, when there was a ceasefire, when task forces were being formed, when ceasefire agreement was being signed, there was no women on the peace table. So that again led to advocacy about engaging women on the peace table, women's participation for peace building. And that's when I discovered the UN Security Council resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. And that has become a passionate tool for me even now when I'm in the CEDAW committee. I'm the focal person for women, peace, and security. And we ask a lot of questions to state parties on how, particularly those who are emerging from conflict, as to how they are engaging women in peace building processes, how they are developing their plans to address women, peace, and security, the protection of women, the violence that women face during war crimes. So here was another example. So once I used the Security Council Resolution 1325, a lot of doors opened. Earlier, we were only targeted to, oh, you go to the women ministry. But suddenly we were then dealing and negotiating with armed forces, with, we were invited Nepal, and Nepal is a culture where they're very receptive to change if you give the right scope, the right environment. So even our armed forces, the Nepal Army, the Nepal Police, started inviting civil society organizations like myself. I've been in, I've conducted training of numerous trainings for the Nepal Army and the Nepal Police on women, peace, and security, how they should integrate this agenda in their training, how they should train their personnel before going overseas for peacekeeping operations. So this resolution, which is a Security Council, UN Security Council resolution, has opened numerous avenues of collaboration for promoting women's participation in peace building. So this was another area, but the other area is we were drafting a new constitution. Our constitution is fairly new, which was the latest constitution was adopted in 2015. So there was a lot of advocacy. It was a constituent assembly. And the women's movement advocated a lot for engendering the constitution. And I do recall using the CEDAW mechanism, constantly, citing what Nepal had committed to and citing the recommendations that the CEDAW committee has given to Nepal. So based on that, we really advocated for engendering the constitution. And our latest constitution, I won't say it's perfect, but it has many pluses and a few minuses, of course, which we still need to work on. And I'm sure with collective efforts, collective movement building, and with relevant UN instruments, particularly CEDAW, we can advocate even further for bringing about that change. So with these important, I want to say that we have used these mechanisms, one, to pass the domestic violence law. The other, let me see what else I have done. We have a national action plan against trafficking in persons in 2012. It was using UN instruments to get all these. We have gender and social inclusion policy of the Election Commission in 2013 to ensure gender equality in the election. National strategy and action plan for the elimination of gender-based violence and the empowerment of women in 2013. Act to amend some acts for maintaining gender equality, 2015. Witchcraft was a huge issue, related accusation act, 2015. You cannot accuse a woman of being a witch, and ostracizing her, stigmatizing her. So that was very much practiced. So we have a law now. We have Sexual Harassment at the Workplace Elimination Act, 2014. We have Safe Motherhood and Reproductive Health Rights Act, which is the latest one in 2018. It's a very progressive act, one of the most progressive in the region, I must say. And all this was possible only because we had strong UN instruments and a strong women's movement, a vibrant movement who could use these instruments and advocate and lobby for these policy changes. So these are, I don't know how much time I have left, but can you, anyway, I'm almost towards the close. And so what I say is now, because I was working in this area, I want to say one more thing, because my topic was from local to global and global to local. In the past decade or so, I have taken the local level experiences, particularly to the UN table on the Commission on the Status of Women meeting. As many of you all may know, it's called the CSW, which takes place every year in March in the UN headquarters in New York. So I started taking these local experiences to the global table, lobbying for the right language, lobbying for the lived-in experiences of the grassroots community women to influence the global policies. Many times I was part of the government delegation also, and I could sit in the negotiations of languages and documents. So got a lot of experience from there as well. But once the agreed conclusions of the Commission on the State Status of Women was adopted, would bring back that commitments again to the local level. So taking the local to the global and bringing the global commitments back to the local level, localizing it, and based on that, advocating for the needed legislative and policy changes. So that has been my experience, and that is the experience that led me to stand for the CEDAW elections in 2016. Nepal is a very small country, and there were many speculations that I may not win the election, coming from a small country, but I'm very happy that the member states trusted me, and I won the election in 2016. So since 2017 to 17 to 20 was my first term. From 2019 to 2022 February, I was the vice chair of the CEDAW committee. I'm still the focal person of women, peace and security within the committee. Then I stood for a second term. The election was in 2020 November. Yes, I'm getting confused of the dates because of the COVID. 2020 November, and this time again, I won the elections with 139 votes out of the 189 votes. There are 189 members that have ratified, member states that have ratified CEDAW. Unfortunately, of course, US, as Mary has already said, has not ratified CEDAW. This is my second mandate, and I'm happy to say that in my second mandate, we have an optional protocol where we have an inquiry mechanism, and I'm the chair of that inquiry mechanism. The inquiry mechanism is like this. If there is a complaint or a submission against a country with evidences that it has violated the rights of women or girls in that country, and we find that we have adequate information to initiate an inquiry, then we inform the concerned member state and we initiate an inquiry on that state, and which may also include a visit to the state party and conducting numerous interviews to initiate that inquiry. So I'm the chair of the inquiry now. We've just finished. In fact, I've just finished my CEDAW session, the 80th session. It was a month-long session. I returned home today itself, and it's, what is the time now? It's 12:19 over here, past midnight. So I feel that the platform that CEDAW has provided me, since I'm a passionate gender advocate, I feel that I am taking the local experiences again to the global level, and with the experience that I have had at the global, regional and grassroots level, trying to shape the CEDAW's work forward in terms of its general recommendations, in terms of its dialogue with state parties. As I said earlier, I'm the focal person for women, peace and security, and we question, a lot of questions to the state parties are on the needed legislations, are on temporary special measures, which is women's participation, affirmative actions, on that, women's participation in national and international affairs. Violence against women is a major topic, trafficking, stigma, the portrayal of women in the media. I ask a lot of questions to state parties on engaging men and boys also, whether they have programs on engaging men and boys, because unless and until you change the mindset and attitudes, that the patriarchal norms and values that are so deeply embedded, you cannot bring about that change. So these are questions we ask state parties, whether they have deliberate efforts. When state parties say they have action plans, we ask them, do they have adequate budget? Whether civil society or women were involved in designing the plan? What is their monitoring mechanism? So these are, we also look at marriage and family life, child marriage, women's economic empowerment, employment, access to health services, education. So CEDAW is a whole bill of rights that addresses all forms of discrimination against women. So I I'm very happy and feel very honored and gratified working for CEDAW, particularly with the background that I have, that the experience that I have, that my passionate working area on violence against women that I bring into the CEDAW committee. And I really hope that this second term also I can contribute to this work as well. But I would like to congratulate the UNA Dane County, Wisconsin chapter also, because it is a member of the city. It is one of the cities for CEDAW, which is so important. So I think you all have shown that even if a country does not ratify the treaty, cities which are so progressive, and when you get together, you will adopt those policies and make sure that it is implemented in the cities. So I wish you all the best, and I really hope that you will continue to engage with UN mechanisms to bring about that change aspired by the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you so much for this honor, and thank you for this opportunity. I will respond to the questions when there's.
Yes, in 1 minute, I will put the questions before you. I just want to reiterate what you have said. The CEDAW Convention has 3 obligations. The obligation to respect equality in laws and in policies, the obligation to protect from discrimination and both direct and indirect, and the obligation to uphold equality and eliminate gender discrimination. So I think that that's you said that, and to the degree that those things are actualized, we actually empower women. So you do have one question in the chat at the moment, which is, let me see, someone asked, can you tell us about your recent work in Afghanistan and how you've used UN instruments? Oh, can't hear you. You need to unmute.
Sorry, yes, I've unmuted. Yes.
It's okay.
Okay, regarding Afghanistan, I feel very much for the state of women and girls in Afghanistan at present, as we all know. And I'm worried and concerned about it. The CEDAW committee is also concerned about it. I've been to Afghanistan. I've been to Kabul. When I went to Kabul, I was actually, because Nepal already had a national action plan on women, peace and security. So I had gone there to conduct a training for them to develop their own national action plan on women, peace and security. So I do feel for them. Not only that, in 2020, just before the COVID started, in February, March, Afghanistan had a constructive dialogue with the CEDAW committee, and I was the lead rapporteur for the Afghanistan constructive dialogue. This was in 2020 March. And the gender minister who had led the delegation, who was there, was very happy with the dialogue. We had given them a lot of recommendations, but there was some skepticism because peace talks was going to take place after that. And they said, we really hope that they were really betting on the peace talks being successful, So I'm very unhappy to see the situation that is there now, and we still don't know what is going to happen. But what I want to share with you is that during the CEDAW 80th session, the CEDAW committee took stock of the situation in Afghanistan, the situation of women and girls in Afghanistan, through the UN organizations who are working in Afghanistan, as well as the Asia Pacific UN CEDAW and UN Women. We took stock of that. We even we formed a special task force to monitor the state of women and girls in Afghanistan and what we could do for them. And I have been appointed the chair of the task force on Afghanistan. We met former Deputy Speaker of Afghanistan, Fauzia Kufi, who came to a session, and we had a conversation with her as well. She shared her concerns as well. And at the end of the session report, we have decided that CEDAW committee will seek for an exceptional report with Afghanistan. Now, that means that because of the situation that is there in Afghanistan, CEDAW committee, according to its its mandate, has the authority to ask a country for an exceptional report if certain issues, urgent issues come up. So we are now exploring how we can, or in what matter and in what modality we can seek for an exceptional report from Afghanistan, particularly following on the status of women and girls, their security, their protection, their rights to be able to work and be independent, their voices. So this is what we have just decided from our 80th session, and I'm looking forward to intensifying our monitoring and seeing how we can send this request for exceptional report from Afghanistan, which might help us to lead, to intervene and see how we can ensure that women's rights are protected.
You have another question. Are there any UN instruments with a focus on gender equity that can be brought to bear on climate negotiations to make sure that women, trans, and non-binary people are represented in climate talks and address this disparity?
No, there isn't a treaty particularly focusing on climate. You talked about climate change, right?
Yes.
Yeah, climate change itself, but I'm happy to say that CEDAW has a general recommendation 37. If you Google it, it's on climate change and disaster risk management in the context of changing climate, and gendered disaster risk management. So if you look into that, the general recommendation is a guidance note. It's an authorized guidance for state parties to follow those. It's an interpretation of what CEDAW's mandate is doing. So we have a detailed authorized guidance to state parties as to how climate change policies, processes, and procedures needs to be inclusive, how they need to include women's voices, women's experiences, and be inclusive, not just women, girls, but all the other marginalized community as well. So that gives the authorized guidance to state parties. And based on that, when we have a constructive dialogue, we do question state parties. We do monitor and review whether they have been following those guidance notes.
Another question is, can you speak to the ongoing horrific treatment of women and girls in African countries that are having internal wars? For example, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and I believe now something is evolving in Uganda.
Well, it's like this. It's not that, the CEDAW committees, you'll have to understand the CEDAW committee's mandate. What the procedure of the CEDAW committee is, every state party that has ratified CEDAW reports to the CEDAW committee every 4 years. And the CEDAW committee reviews the report of the state party, as well as the alternative reports provided by civil society, reports provided by the UN entities working in that country, and the human rights institutions in that country. So after reviewing all these reports and doing its own research, the CEDAW committee enters into a dialogue with the state party, appreciates what it has done in some cases, and points out the gaps and lacunas, and then issues, based on the constructive dialogue, it's called concluding observations, which is a set of recommendations that the state should fulfill within the next 4 years. We do pick 4 priority areas, which has to be filled in 2 years. So it's not like we have the authority at any point of time to pick a country, but let's say, for example, this CEDAW 88th session, which we have just ended, this mid-October to mid-November, we dealt with Yemen, South Sudan. You're talking about conflict-affected countries. So these are the 2 countries that that came into dialogue. So based on the information that we had a dialogue with the state parties of these 2 countries, and we have pointed out our concerns and issued a set of recommendations to them as well, which will be monitored by the CEDAW committee. in its next session. So that's how we do it. It's not that, we just pick up countries.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Are there any sort of comments that you would like to make based on the questions?
There is one now.
Do you get good compliance from countries, right?
I
Okay.
didn't see that one.
Look,
Okay.
let me be very honest here. Most countries, including my country, said, oh, another reporting, like when the reporting time comes. They find reporting quite burdensome, actually, particularly if you are a small developing country and you do not have the kind of financial and human resources to be reporting effectively. And then you have ratified 7, 9, 8 treaties, and there's so much reporting mechanisms to do. So governments do find that cumbersome. But what I have been telling, particularly my government, is if we don't have a proper monitoring mechanism, and here is an independent global platform that will monitor, because every country wants to be progressive, will monitor for you what is going wrong on a particular issue and provide you with recommendations. So this should be taken as a very progressive step, but do they comply? I gave you examples of Nepal, where if it were not for the CEDAW Convention, perhaps we wouldn't have had those numerous laws that I mentioned to you. The Safe Motherhood law, which also deals with sexual and reproductive health and rights. We have a domestic violence law. We have abortion legalized on key cases. So these are issues which would never have come up. But I won't say that 100% they comply. That is the reason we have frequent dialogues. Now, there's a difference between, I feel that the treaty bodies are extremely important because it's a legally binding framework, and there's a strong reporting mechanism that a country has to report to. Apart from SDGs, Beijing Platform for Action, they are political documents, which actually you don't really need to have it doesn't have a legally binding framework. But of course, countries have to do it. But I think it is treaty bodies like CEDAW which bring in even the political commitments of the Beijing Platform for Action, of the SDGs, into our reporting framework. We ask question state parties on their Beijing commitments, on their SDG commitments. So it is their Security Council resolution commitments. So it is through that mechanism that we make them accountable. So these are very interlinked, So not all countries comply, as you say, but some do it very progressively, some do it very gradually. You can't have a constructive dialogue and have the same benchmark for all countries. But what is important is that the country must have made progress from the last 4 years to this 4 years, and how it will progress in the next 4 years. So I think this is important process for countries who are part of the United States, who are part of United Nations to comply to. And it gives us satisfaction to see how a country has progressed in the last 4 years. So.
Right. Thank you for reminding us that the work of the UN is not categorically legal. It is a global mechanism that allows dialogue, conversation, and pushes the will of folks through its conventions to do, I suppose, for lack of a better term, the right thing or the meritorious thing or the equity thing in terms of whatever focus it has. And that dialogue is always, regrettably or unfortunately, encompassed in the political will and the dynamics of the situation of that particular country. But what is important is that the dialogue and the discussion gets raised. So I think, Bandana, as you have identified, without you being able to raise these questions in Nepal, you wouldn't have the progress that you now have, because what the global statistics show is that every minute somewhere in the world, a woman dies of childbirth. So this is important in terms of these discussions. Mary, there is a question for you, and that is, would you restate the rationale why the United States has not ratified CEDAW?
Well, Barbara, I didn't actually say why.
Okay.
The arguments that are put forward are that if we sign CEDAW, it would reduce U.S. sovereignty and impact U.S. law. And the argument, like people like the late Jesse Helms, who was one of the big spokesmen against CEDAW, he would say over and over again that the treaty was at best unnecessary and at worst subjected the U.S. to the whims of an international agency. All of these objections to CEDAW are, in my opinion, ridiculous. Let's start with the sovereignty issue. Treaties adopted by the United States are not self-executing. This means legislation to implement any treaty provision would come before the House and the Senate in the same way as any other bill. Also, countries can and do express what are called reservations, understandings, and declarations to UN conventions, where there are discrepancies between the convention and domestic law. When this happens, the treaty calls on states to take appropriate measures to progressively promote the principle of non-discrimination. Such language upholds U.S. sovereignty and grants no enforcement authority to the United Nations. On the issue of CEDAW's advocacy of reproductive rights and enforcement of gender-neutral work rules, CEDAW does not address the matter of abortion, and according to the U.S. State Department, is abortion neutral. Many countries in which abortion is illegal, such as Ireland, when that was the case there, and Burkina Faso and Rwanda, have ratified the convention. So I think the arguments that are put forward against ratifying CEDAW are basic conservative positions put forward largely by Republican senators. I hope that answers the question.
Okay. And this is the one last question. Are there examples that you can cite of organized religion supporting or pushing back on women's rights as expressed in CEDAW?
I think Bandana can probably address that better than I can.
Yeah, it is for her. I'm sorry, I should have said that.
No, thank you. It's a tough question, because it's like this, CEDAW is a progressive treaty body, but of course there are countries, particularly Islamic countries, where there are plural laws, and Islamic principles overrule the compliance to the CEDAW Convention. So yes, we do. It's not an organized religion country. I wouldn't call that. But there are countries where Islamic principles overrule the compliance to CEDAW conventions. Mm-hmm. And that brings a lot of complexities. But we do work on, that the CEDAW should be, it's a strong belief that the CEDAW should be the overriding convention. Even if your constitution, it should be above the constitution. That is our belief. And we continue to tell member states that it should not discriminate women at any cost, so that is our thing. Mary talked about reservations, but there are certain countries who have ratified CEDAW, but they have reservations, particularly sometimes in the constitutional legislations, because they consider Islamic is above, the CEDAW Convention, if there are certain Islamic rules, principles, policies. So there are reservations also, some of them in Article 5, some of them, mostly, quite a number of them, on marriage and family relations. A lot of sexual minority issues do come up, but we do address issues related to sexual minorities, particularly LBT, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender women. we do bring up those as well, discrimination against them. So a lot depends on the information that we get from alternate sources, which we question the state parties and appeal to them, urge them to comply to the convention. Thank you.
Well, I think what the question and answers document, and thank you, Bandana, is that the first step in making change is raising the questions and putting forth possible solutions to consider. And CEDAW is a platform where that happens. So thank you for being there, for making sure that these significant questions and issues about equity and equality for women at least get on the table. So that's very important. And, you know, as you say, as they say, Rome wasn't built in a day, and it'll take time. But the pursuit is significant, and we can't thank you enough for that. That includes our questions at this time, and I'll turn it back to Linda Bauman.